Hello, I'm Jordan Fox Besek. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at W.E.B, and welcome to my virtual Scholars at Hallwalls talk. This talk is titled W.E.B. Du Bois and Interdisciplinarity, how Du Bois fused natural science into his political projects. Before I begin, I'd like to thank David Maki and the other fellows at the Humanities Institute, Anna Chemay and Neil Terry for their production assistance with this recording, Brett Clark, Professor of Sociology at the University of Utah, and Patrick Greiner, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Vanderbilt University, for their intellectual support. Oh, get that the way. As well as the staff of the Special Collections and University Archives at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, for their immense patience and assistance with this project. So this talk is about W.E.B. Du Bois, a figure whose reputation is currently experiencing a renaissance in critical scholarship. The reasons for this renaissance are many, from forces beyond academia, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, decolonial movements, as well as forces within. Most importantly, the realization that us scholars must continually reevaluate our history to better understand how the intellectual limits we impose on ourselves, the questions we ask, and the way our resources have been influenced by colonial, racist, speciesist, and other historical inequalities. Indeed, throughout much of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois had been cut out, at times actively, from my own discipline of sociology. And this is a travesty. For it was Du Bois that introduced our 20th century conceptions of race as a cultural and not biological category. It was Du Bois who was the founder of a distinct world systems perspective of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, one that included processes of not only race but class and gender. It was Du Bois who was the intellectual founder of the civil rights movement. It was Du Bois who was one of the first prominent figures to insist that black culture is something to be proud of. It was Du Bois who was the founder of whiteness studies. It was Du Bois who was the U.S. founder of nothing less than empirical sociology itself, with the Philadelphia Negro. Today, there is a growing effort to acknowledge Du Bois as perhaps the greatest American sociologist, and this talk is part of that effort. Now, Du Bois was a trained sociologist and taught sociology at Atlanta and elsewhere, but his influence was, of course, more than scholarly and reached well beyond the discipline. He was first and foremost a civil rights activist, but also the longtime editor of The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP, a humanist, and a popular historian. And during these scholarly and public efforts, a great deal of his time was spent repudiating the scientific racism infecting natural sciences and popular thought. A scientific racism that is not gone, I will note, but persists in other forms, but that's for another talk. For in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, many widely respected intellectuals, including some of the most prominent sociologists, were proclaiming that empirical evidence exists to justify a natural white superiority. Tearing down this manifestation of scientific racism was thus a necessary project for Du Bois, and he spent much of his career publicly and repeatedly disproving racist claims of biological determinism. This talk is not, however, about the way Du Bois tore down the political ideologies of racist science, a subject which has received plenty of attention. It is rather about how, throughout this effort, Du Bois demonstrated a sophisticated and critical engagement with natural science. Of course, influenced by developments in contemporary debates, personal relationships, historical context, and his own politics, Du Bois's epistemological approach was never static. Yet one aspect of his epistemological practice that remained fairly constant was his critical, open, and sophisticated engagement with natural science, one which remains an overlooked and neglected dimension of his thought. In this talk, I will show that throughout his life, Du Bois actively developed an interdisciplinary approach that combined knowledge from the sciences, history, and cultural studies to analyze a broad range of pressing issues, including questions regarding race, and that this interdisciplinary approach was nuanced and multidimensional. The most essential part of this interdisciplinarity was the recognition that the natural sciences are socially situated, a fact which can bias the questions posed, the frameworks employed to study issues, and the interpretations of findings. Thus, he noted that some of the findings of natural scientists may reflect their unconscious or conscious biases that are used to justify racist ideologies and inequalities. Such problems are also ever present within the social sciences and humanities, issues that Du Bois continually addressed throughout his life. Despite these challenges and concerns, however, Du Bois knew that a serious engagement with natural sciences, just as it was with the social sciences and humanities, was important and necessary in order to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the world. For these reasons, Du Bois intently followed developments in evolutionary biology, geography, physical anthropology, and the history and philosophy of science. He befriended many leaders in these fields, assigned their work to his students, and during his editorship of the Crisis, recommended it to his readers. My point in this talk is not that what Du Bois claimed or did remains true or false, or that he was free from contradiction, but rather that his thoughtful, consistent engagement with and as appropriate incorporation of natural science remains relevant. For this talk, in addition to well-known books, I've examined primary materials, including correspondence, unpublished essays, schoolwork, notes, and ephemera held at the special collections and university archives at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I've also surveyed the Crisis during the tenure of Du Bois's editorship. What emerges from this study is a picture of Du Bois as a scholar who, from his Bachelor of Arts forward, integrated the explanatory potential of scientific observation while insightfully placing this knowledge within its political, historical, spatial, and epistemological context, even if he was inconsistently skeptical of how his own historical and epistemological context impacted this approach. Natural sciences were necessary for Du Bois, but they were also fallible, just like the social sciences and humanities. Physical, cultural, and political influences existed within an indelible tension, an understanding that demanded a multi-causal, contingent, and interdisciplinary approach. Finally, while these considerations were a persistent aspect of Du Bois's thought, he consistently and rightly insisted that racial stratification could solely be explained through socio-historical processes. I would like to now focus our attention on a brief correspondence Du Bois had while editor of the Crisis. On February 18, 1932, the Harlem pastor Adam Clayton Powell wrote to Du Bois in his capacity as editor of the Crisis, asking Du Bois to publish his recent address at an NAACP mass meeting in an upcoming issue. On February 25th, Du Bois responded, quote, "I have read your address with greatest interest. I should criticize adversely only one statement, and that is on page 10 and 11 about Darwin's Origin of Species. I do not think that it is historically accurate to say that this book advocates the survival of the fittest or the conservation of races. That doctrine was developed entirely apart from Darwin's book and long before its appearance. The book was seized upon to support that doctrine, when as a matter of fact it did not at all. What Darwin said about the survival of the fittest was simply a scientific statement of the results of competition between living beings, but he did not for a moment mean by fittest those who ought to survive. It was simply a statement that, as a matter of fact, some would survive. As an interpretation of scientific facts, Darwin and his successors are, to my mind, unanswerable. But on the other hand, the philosophy of superior races, built up long before Darwin, is of course deserving of all the criticism you put upon it." End quote. Du Bois's understanding of an approach to interdisciplinarity is here in full form. He carefully read Darwin, appreciated the nuance of the argument, the larger historical context that shaped debates, and the various consequences of distinct conclusions. He was able to assess the evolutionary argument while also emphasizing the socio-historical conditions, including the development and maintenance of asymmetries of power and the control of violence across populations, were responsible for racial inequalities. He stressed that the empirical evidence should be read as culminating in the mechanics of natural selection as a matter of fact, not as a value judgment that anything ought to happen. He placed Darwin, as well as those who come before and after, within historical and political context. While Darwin was no decolonial saint, he rightly insisted that Darwin should not be liable for the racist ideologues that seized his work to cloak their own agenda in scientific objectivity. Darwin's work can clearly tell us a lot about the world, yet its production and reception are indicative of its historical and political context. Not only did Du Bois believe in the importance of these points, but he deemed them worth defending to the powerful pastor, then head of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, which at the time had the largest membership of any church in the country. For Du Bois, how one reads Darwin is clearly not a minor issue. After much back and forth, Du Bois eventually agreed to publish an excerpt of Powell's address. The portion published, however, does not contain the statement at issue. Du Bois was nearly 64 when he wrote that reply to Powell. He had, by this point, been thinking through his approach to natural science for decades. The earliest example I could find of this were from Du Bois's days as a student at Harvard, where he spent his initial years largely under the guidance of William James and shared with his mentor a general disgust with Spencerian organicism. Yet Du Bois was no sycophant. Around 1889 or 1890, Du Bois wrote an essay for his composition course that revealed a detachment from James's line of thinking in regard to his elder's insistence upon an unbridgeable gap between observed facts and ethical belief. Written during a popular appraisal of Leonardo da Vinci's empirics, Du Bois reviewed the astronomical, optical, mechanical, and anatomical work of da Vinci. He argued that da Vinci deserved the title of the founder of modern experiential science. In making this argument, he juxtaposed da Vinci's metaphysics with those of the three rivals for the honor, Roger Bacon, William Gilbert, and Francis Bacon. He proposed that da Vinci was the first to theorize and develop general principles almost purely from patient observational work. Throughout his career, Du Bois would similarly insist that the discovery of broader truths through measured empirical investigation is, in fact, possible, both scientifically and ethically. As Du Bois's biographer, David Levering Lewis notes, the epistemic gap between James and Du Bois began at Harvard and grew exponentially throughout the latter's life. From at least this time at Harvard forward, Du Bois demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of science, especially in regards to what Richard Levins would call the dual nature of science, or that science is both a powerful tool for understanding the world and a fallible human activity that reflects the social conditions of its production. In other words, it is socially mediated, yet also serves as the basis for acquiring information about the world. As a graduate student, Du Bois was already deeply concerned with the history of empiricism and conscious of his own epistemological approach to science. Throughout his career, he advocated for an interdisciplinary approach that valued both empiricism and historicity, believing that this approach helped strengthen and check science. After receiving a second bachelor's and master's degree in history at Harvard, Du Bois spent 2 years at the University of Berlin. It was the height of the German Historical School of Economics, which embodied the inductive values Du Bois celebrated in his essay on Da Vinci. Du Bois studied under Gustav von Schmoller and Adolf Wagner, political economists who, according to Lewis, had a profound impact on him. These two advocated for careful, multi-method empirical study of phenomena, for denaturalizing economic processes by placing them within their changing cultural, spatial, and historical context, and for openly discussing the policy implications of their work. Du Bois applied all of these research values when he returned to the United States in 1899 for his landmark study, The Philadelphia Negro. In all, Du Bois left Harvard and Berlin as a scholar deeply committed to culture and history, but one who still incorporated knowledge from the natural sciences in a non-essentialist, historically specific, and reflexive manner. This approach culminated in 1897's Conservation of Races, today recognized as Du Bois's first mature work. For instance, he wrote that, and I quote, "So far as purely physical characteristics are concerned, the difference between men do not explain all the differences of their history. It declares, as Darwin himself said, that great as is the physical unlikeness of the various races of men, their likenesses are far greater. And upon this rests the whole scientific doctrine of human brotherhood." End quote. While clearly foregrounding race as a political, cultural, and moral project, Du Bois also held a deep respect for what he considered to be legitimate natural science. As such, he acknowledged that natural science was surely unable to explain all the differences, but in perhaps unknown ways, disjunctively helped round out the picture, even if that rounding out only took the form of confirming the impoverishment of genetic explanation for social circumstances and outcomes. Ergo, according to Chuck Jeffers, one of today's foremost Du Bois scholars, scientific theory for Du Bois represents part of race's reality, end quote. Kyla Schuller, meanwhile, stresses that this position represents a sophisticated recognition of the dynamic, co-evolutionary relationship between human beings and the larger biophysical world. As Du Bois, she writes, approached evolutionary thought as a resource for racial groups are dynamic systems rather than stationary points on a hierarchy. He contested racial determinism by drawing on the evolutionary notion of population, a fluctuating, malleable entity, conceivable only through the measures of temporality and change. As a result, end quote, he developed a broader understanding of human development and relationships, while also being able to specify the social and historical factors that generated racial inequality and oppression. Yet clearly, the inclusion of such interdisciplinary insights, especially those from natural sciences, are repeatedly misunderstood, often willfully so, and in myriads of ways. These include the lack of consideration for data collection in historical context, variation in how biology, social conditions, and environmental factors may interact, and the ways in which political practices shape such interactions. Nevertheless, as Du Bois repeatedly stressed, to understand race, health, and human beings in general, it is necessary to consider both natural and social sciences. For these reasons, throughout his career, Du Bois not only stayed abreast of developments in a wide array of scientific disciplines, but actively also collaborated with geographers, physical anthropologists, and other natural scientists to consider how best to politically confront scientific racism and more broadly the problem of the color line. Du Bois directly reflected upon these interdisciplinary approaches in an essay that remained unpublished for nearly 100 years. The essay is entitled Sociology Hesitant. This essay provides a window into how he fit his cautiously realist picture of science within his own sociological practice. Its title refers to a contemporary identity crisis in sociology, one derived from open questions regarding what sociology is per se, what sociologists should actually be doing, and how sociologists should relate to other more established disciplines. As Du Bois saw it, these issues all derive from the question of whether or not established scientific methodologies should be applied to sociological projects, one which had left sociologists vacillating between Spencerian positivism and metaphysical wanderings. The answer, Du Bois insists, is certainly not through employing biological metaphors, for these imply knowledge but do not supply it. This is because the goal can never be to formulate the exact laws of human action. Simply to propose such a thing is preposterous. Quote, nor should sociologists look to psychology for answers, a discipline which has scant welcome for sociological novices. The answer, according to Du Bois, is rather to face up to real life in that in the deeds of men there lies, along with rule and rhythm, along with physical law and biological habit, a something incalculable. Sociologists, however, he explained, had heretofore been hesitant to acknowledge the limits of sociology, that it will never be an exact science, and that this is a world of chance as well as law. In Du Bois's eyes, this is the paradox that sociologists must frankly state. He then affirms, this is what the true students of sociology have been doing now a half-century or more. They have adopted the speech and assumption of humanity in regard to human action, and yet studied those actions with all possible scientific accuracy. They have refused to cloud their reason with metaphysical entities, undiscovered and undiscoverable. And they have also refused to neglect the greatest possible field of scientific investigation because they are unable to find laws similar to the law of gravitation. They have assumed a world of physical law peopled by beings capable in some degree of actions inexplicable and uncalculable according to these laws, and their object has been to determine as far as possible the limits of the uncalculable. What then is the future path open before sociology? It must seek a working hypothesis, which will include sociology and physics, end quote. In other words, sociological inquiry requires interdisciplinarity, given that human beings and human history are influenced by myriad forces, processes, and conditions. The goal, Du Bois claimed, is that we would no longer have two separate realms of human knowledge, speaking a mutually unintelligent language, but one realm, and in physical science studying the manifestations of force and natural law, and the other, sociology, assuming the data of physics and studying within that realm what determinate forces is acted on by human wills, by indeterminate force. The point is to give scope to historian as well as the biologist. The path before sociology, in other words, is one that is interdisciplinary by necessity. For this reason, throughout his life, Du Bois pursued staying abreast of new developments in natural science. He devoted time to seeking new knowledge, interrogated it, and recommended it to his colleagues, students, and the public. For example, late 1905, Du Bois wrote to Clark Whistler, then acting curator of the Museum of Natural History in New York City, and he asked for the best works of Negro anthropology and ethnology. Whistler replied that such literature is unfortunately incomplete and unsatisfactory. Nevertheless, he recommended work by Frederick Ratzel, who Du Bois is already familiar with, and a small book by Joseph Denneker, useful mainly for the references contained therein. Du Bois wrote order in pencil next to Denneker reference in the letter. Du Bois was already in contact with Whistler's mentor, Franz Boas, who was the previous curator at the museum. Boas was at that time the most distinguished anthropologist in the United States, yet he was a controversial figure. He robbed graves for skeletons and commandeered indigenous prisoners for cranial measurements. He revealed that there was much variation in the cranial index of adults within the same group, undermining one of the attempts to scientifically rank and order the human population by race, under the assumption, of course, that the white population had larger brains and therefore were more advanced. Boas was ostracized by his department at Columbia for his ardent rejection of armchair, non-evidential scientific racism. In the October 7, 1905 issue of Charities, Boas published his first popular article against scientific racism. Within 4 days, Du Bois began actively courting Boas, hoping the latter would travel to Atlanta University in May 1906 to address the 11th Conference of the Study of Negro Problems, an annual conference Du Bois and his students held in Atlanta. That year, the conference theme was the health and physique of the Negro American. According to the report published afterwards, which now serves as an early harbinger of public health research, its purpose was to update discussions of race problems with advances in anthropological science that have been made in the last decade. In particular, anthropology was placing emphasis on cranial, facial, skeletal characteristics, over such things as hair, lips, skin, so forth. Though Du Bois was disappointed Boas could not make it in time for his own speech, he was left too astonished to speak by Boas's address later in the conference. For Boas forcefully maintained that contemporary physical anthropology had demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that whatever cranial differences exist between races is insignificant when compared to the wide range of individual variability in each race. He stressed that the evidence showed that no demand in the mind or body is beyond the Negro, in contrast to scientifically racist claims. He then backed up this assertion by detailing the significant agricultural, militaristic, political, and technological advances contributed by the African peoples to the development of human culture throughout history. All this I'd never heard, Du Bois reflected, and I came then and afterwards to realize how the silence and neglect of science can lead truth utterly to disappear or be unconsciously distorted. It was likely this moment that inspired Du Bois to contribute to social scientific understandings of the historical development and achievements of African civilizations. Indeed, in a lecture prepared concerning the Negro in America and some higher civilizations in Africa, Du Bois noted, the implications of the African background are more social than biological. I propose to show that certain African peoples have developed social organizations which compare favorably with those which we regard as the achievement of civilization. That they have developed towns and cities and states and markets and exchanges, a juridical system and a jury system, a method of tracing property descent and property rights, and art. And that these owe very little, if anything, to the influence of or example of the so-called higher cultures. When we think of civilization, we think of a single evolution of which different cultures are steps. There are many civilizations. End quote. Meanwhile, Boas, whose statements should be noted were always cautiously phrased, that he never claimed all races had equal capacities, but only that no one had ever been able to prove they did not, ended up participating in future Atlantic conferences and contributing essays to The Crisis. He was generally an ally of Du Bois, and Du Bois an ally of him for decades to come. During his 24 years as editor of The Crisis, Du Bois used the magazine as a platform to articulate his personal views and to promote social and natural scientific knowledge. Here, as elsewhere, He took Boas's 1906 address to heart, vowing to not neglect science and to constantly confront it. On the one hand, Du Bois drew on contemporary physiological, anthropological, archaeological, and other natural sciences, combining them with human sciences to better contextualize black histories. Such interdisciplinarity was necessary if its readership was to unearth lines of descent, both physical and social, erased by slavery and colonialism. In bringing this work to light, he was able to reconstruct an alternative, non-white politics in which black history became a source of pride. On the other hand, he would use knowledge from natural sciences to consistently and forcefully attack any and all forms of scientific racism. In the first issue of The Crisis, published November 1910, in the first section, along the color line, under the subheading Social Uplift, there is a report regarding the recent work by the French archaeologist M. de Zeltner, who, after studying ruins of unknown cities, runic signs, and drawings on the upper Senegal River, reportedly claimed that powerful Negro empires of great size and some culture existed in the Sudan before the white races entered Africa. M. Zeltner thinks that the archaeological exploration of the African continent is yet in its infancy and will doubtless yield surprising results in establishing the advanced state of development attained by the black races in early times. Later in that same issue, under the subheading Science, it is noted that a recent study by Cornell professor Bert Wilder provided evidence that, in a direct rebuke to scientific racism, mere brain weight is no indication of mentality. Then, in the second issue, The Crisis published an article by Boas addressing the real race problem. In the third issue, Jane Addams blamed social segregation on the contemptuous attitude of the so-called superior races. In the fifth issue, The Crisis detailed how startling results following the last 10 years of excavations in Upper Sudan led Dr. Schweinfurth, the famous German ethnologist, and Dr. von Luschen of the University of Berlin, as well as their European colleagues, to the conclusion that the black man, not the white, was the first to discover the art of working metals, and gave this knowledge, which was the first great step forward in civilization, to Europe and near Asia. 10 years later, The Crisis criticized President Harding's attack on racial amalgamation with the Voice of Science. In 1932, The Crisis, the anthropologist Ernest Houghton reviewed archaeological and anthropological history to facetiously conclude that if there are racial differences in mentality between Negroes and whites, it may be that whites cannot devise intelligent tests, which are fairly applicable to Negroes. During Du Bois's editorship of The Crisis, he additionally reported on and recommended scientific works in its What to Read section. For instance, he encouraged readers to consider Peter Kropotkin's prescient defense of natural selection as a co-evolutionary, cooperation-based process. Throughout his teaching career, he assigned a large amount of natural scientific work so students could grapple with socio-natural relationships. For example, in fall 1937, he had his graduate students in sociology at Atlanta read the anti-eugenicist Lancelot Hogman's Genetic Principles in Medicine and Social Science, which highlighted the interdependence of genes and environment. Now, most of the studies Du Bois and his students grappled with had a relational, dialectical view of science, and many of them explicitly embraced forms of social justice. Some, however, did not, but were important to engage as part of the larger discussion and debate. In the first issue of the third volume of The Crisis, Du Bois recommended Ellen Churchill Semple's The Influence of Geography on the Environment, which was a decidedly geographic determinist text. In his aforementioned graduate class, in addition to Hogman, he had his students read Ellsworth Huntington's Civilization and Climate, which claims that climate determined human accomplishments. For Du Bois, it was crucially important to understand the range of arguments. While Du Bois was at times unable to escape his own elitism, to see beyond the epistemological trappings of his own age, he took the broad range of scientific knowledge very seriously. He believed that no ideas or arguments could stand alone. Thus, it was necessary to critically assess all work and consider its contributions to understanding the world. In most of his later writings in African history, Du Bois incorporated the approach of the then popular possibilism school of French geography, which held that environmental conditions set spatially and historically specific, if non-determinist, constraints on social life. He was keen to detail how, for example, physical distinctions depend obviously on climate, diet, and environment, yet these are of no intrinsic significance. they are of no intrinsic significance unless they indicate lines of evolution and deeper physical, mental, and social differences. Whatever men may believe concerning this, there is no clear scientific proof. In this, Du Bois embraced an open, relational, interdisciplinary approach, anathema to physical, biological, and geographic determinisms. It is one that is driven by the exploration of as yet unknown boundaries between biological, geographic, and diasporic racial histories. The incorporation of such boundaries, however unclear, is ultimately not restricting, however, for Du Bois, but politically freeing. For instance, in a 1909 address, Du Bois remarked, "What the age of Darwin has done is to add to the 18th century idea of individual worth the complementary idea of physical immortality of the human race. And this, far from annulling or contracting the idea of human freedom, rather emphasizes its necessity and eternal possibility, the boundlessness and endlessness of human achievement. Freedom has come to mean individual caprice or aberration, but social self-realization in an endless chain of selves. And freedom for such development is not the denial, but the central assertion of evolutionary theory. So too, the doctrine of human equality passes through the fire of scientific inquiry, not obliterated, but transfigured. Not equality of present attainment, but equality of opportunity. For unbounded future attainments is the rightful demand of mankind." Quote. If, in other words, one pays attention to the limits of natural science, it becomes plain that nature cannot provide higher meaning in itself. With this in mind, natural science for Du Bois is not a biological straitjacket. It is rather a platform for humanistic and emancipatory politics. For the appropriate incorporation of natural science and natural history provide entire populations of people who share a common history the ability to make their own meaning and determine themselves as they see fit. Darwin and the natural sciences more generally offer the cathartic opportunity to explore this variety of socio-historical experiences, so long as the lessons drawn from such resources were approached as standing in relation with, or more likely driven by, cultural, political, economic, and other social processes. Natural science for Du Bois was in this way necessary and liberating. To be clear, throughout these works, Du Bois insisted that monopoly power and colonialism were the principal shapers of contemporary race relations. He did not in any way incorporate natural history into his work in order to propose that differences in natural history, be they biological or geographic, established racial or other forms of inequality. He rather incorporated natural science for the opposite reason: to contest racial determinisms by demonstrating how processes of natural selection render populations feasible through change and change only. Recounting racial histories in part through natural histories. In his books, The Negro, Black Folk Then and Now in Africa, Its Geography, Peoples, and Products, and elsewhere in other books, was ultimately a form of emancipatory politics, one which embraced both social and natural dynamism to reveal the range of factors that influence the histories of populations around the world. It illuminated the possibilities of change, while also specifying that the social historical conditions that shaped inequality had to be addressed. Contesting racial determinisms necessitated an epistemic pluralism, one that he was humble enough to respond to and reassess as political, cultural, personal, and scientific context changed. For example, in notes for an unpublished manuscript, likely from 1946, Du Bois reflected upon the limits of what we can know about the world outside of our heads. After affirming that such a world exists independently of our emotions, he warns that we should all hold all truth, tentatively and watchfully, ready to change our conceptions once a new explanation fits the facts more perfectly. Furthermore, one should never be held back from accepting new scientific truth because we fear the ghosts of our fathers, for slowly but surely the scientific spirit prevails, particularly in regard to the outer world. Here Du Bois is demonstrating a cautiously realist picture of science. He clearly believes that interdisciplinary science is a reasonable, even necessary tool for understanding what the world is like, asserting that science is dynamic and knowledge must change in order to fit the facts more perfectly. Yet there remains a necessary humility, one gleaned from Du Bois's awareness of the fits and starts that spot histories of science. Scientific knowledge in this picture is necessary but forever partial, circumscribed, delimited, and contextually dependent, in a word, mortal. Ever since his history in Da Vinci, Du Bois was cognizant of this dual nature of science. Conclusion. Du Bois was a broad interdisciplinary scholar who forged an approach to examine human history in relation to biophysical worlds. He actively engaged the social and natural sciences as well as humanities in order to develop a more comprehensive understanding of everything around him. At the same time, he confronted scientific racism, rooting his critique in knowledge from the broader constellation of scientific research. His interdisciplinary approach, the outlines of which developed during his education at Harvard and in Germany, was wholly humble and intensely political. It was humble that he recognized how, in all cases, science is an imperfect social process reflecting the epistemological and material conditions of its production. And that the natural sciences, the human sciences, and the relationships between the two all had clear explanatory limits. And in that he believed the separation of various disciplines should be denaturalized without renouncing their independent value. Nevertheless, Du Bois's defense of interdisciplinary science was deeply political. First and foremost, he was unwavering in his conviction that any scientific theory promoting a racial and other form of injustice was categorically wrong. He understood that a correct approach to relationships between natural and social sciences meant that barbarism could no longer be shrouded under ostensible notions of scientific objectivity. Furthermore, he did not defend natural or social science as is. He rather sought to engage scientists in multiple disciplines in order to employ comprehensive knowledge as a source of uplift. For instance, it was an opportunity to refine heretofore subjugated histories that could become radical political resources. An indelible element of this project, however, was understanding that the proper place for natural science and physical influence within his sociological approach. This place was relational, contingent, dynamic, and complex. It situated natural sciences as potential resources that could help explain part of socio-historical processes. It never employed natural sciences as resources that could help explain what drove social inequalities. That was a space reserved for the analysis of socio-histories, which included slavery, colonialism, and monopoly capital. The systemic racism Du Bois experienced in his personal and professional life obscured many possibilities for this sociological thought and practice. It is only rather recently that sociologists have begun the epistemological work necessary to engage with thoughts in fields as far-flung as biology, epidemiology, architecture, engineering, and computer science, work that is requisite if sociologists are to meaningfully contribute to many of the daunting social challenges of the 21st century. If Du Bois's interdisciplinarity had been taken seriously earlier, there is a chance that these efforts might not appear so novel, but rather as indelible parts of a vibrant, robust sociological enterprise. To be clear, I am not claiming that substantive elements of Du Bois's interdisciplinarity should be instinctively mimicked. The substance of Du Bois's interdisciplinarity reflects his historical moment and should stand as such. What I am instead claiming is that if Du Bois's influences should expand beyond narrow conversations of race, rediscovering and incorporating his interdisciplinary openness is one part of his legacy that can provide new ground for such development. Following Du Bois in this regard means refusing to see the study of socio-natural relationships to natural scientists alone. Critically, it also involves encouraging natural scientists, from geneticists to climatologists, to understand the social processes that shape both their objects of study as well as the ways in which they study them. At best, it reminds sociologists that sociology cannot stand alone. We should collaborate with and learn from natural scientists to consider more carefully how to conduct research that can influence human lives in a positive way. Fundamentally, such aims involve respecting disciplinary boundaries but not being bound by them. Du Bois clearly understood that methodological approaches in the natural sciences could not become a guide for the social sciences. Still, he remained attuned to the fact the objects of study in the human sciences and natural sciences interact. The form and function of such interaction, however, is often unknown, and as such, Du Bois was aware of the disciplinary limits as he was of disciplinary possibilities. Thank you very much.